Just been watching the famous film Braveheart. I spoke about this before, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. But Braveheart is a very famous, very moving film. It's about the 14th century, early 14th century Scottish outlaw, rebel, patriot, whatever you want to call him, William Wallace, who was executed in 1305 and is credited with leading the Scottish rebellion against English rule at the time during the First Scottish War of Independence, portrayed by Mel Gibson. Um, Cinematically, it's a very impressive film. It's a wonderful soundtrack by Jack Horner, and it won Best Picture for 1995. It's also famous, though, or infamous, for the very large number of inaccuracies. Leaving aside the politics, even the clothing is inaccurate. They have woad that is painted blue on the faces, um, which was used by the Picts in from the Iron Age into about the 5th century, 6th century, whereas the events of Braveheart take place in the 13th century. They also wear kilts, which weren't really popularised until at least the late 15th century during clan warfare. So, as one critic pointed out, this would be the equivalent of a film set in colonial era America, with the colonialists wearing 20th century business costumes. So I hope no one got awards for outfits and costumes in Braveheart because it was totally inaccurate. But like I say, it is cinematically impressive. The battle scenes are vicious and bloody, as medieval warfare was. Um, and it's a moving film, no two ways about it. Unfortunately, it is highly inaccurate. Now, to be fair, I don't think very many people are going to be influenced by a film. Even some nationalists during the referendum admitted that it's just a film. However, there will be some, I believe, absolutely will be influenced by it because that's the power that film can have. The same year, incidentally, the film Rob Roy was released, which was much less about English Scottish tensions, much more to do with Highland Lowland tensions and Jacobite Hanoverian issues. Anyway, since I'm in this sort of frame of mind, I thought just to speak a little bit about the prospect of a second independence referendum. The idea of it, frankly, makes my stomach turn. I hated the division caused by the last one. I hate the prospect of the United Kingdom breaking apart. I wear my heart on my sleeve with this because I am passionate about this country. The United Kingdom is my country. I love it, and I will absolutely speak in favour of it staying together. I'm just going to quote some statistics. These are important. So, the results of the Scottish independence referendum in September 2014: 2,002,000 Scots voted to stay in the United Kingdom. 1,618,000 Scots voted to leave to become an independent country. Now, this was on an 82% turnout, and in British politics, that's a very high turnout. Now, the recent EU referendum, what was it, May, June 2015, 1,661,000 Scots voted to remain in the EU, 1,018,000 voted to leave. That was in a 67% turnout. In other words, a significantly lower turnout than the Scottish independence referendum. In fact, that turnout is more akin to a general election. Um, in the general election, the SNP done well, but I think that was much more to do with various issues against Labour rather than a desire for nationalism. And that's something the SNP hasn't really taken on board. Now, Nicola Sturgeon is a canny politician. She did say, "Oh, we know not everyone who voted for us is voting for independence." Nevertheless, the SNP, by its very nature, isn't a pro-independence party. It's a nationalist party, and that is ultimately their only agenda. Um, I honestly believe that in every other issue they have no conviction. They have conviction on that. They're hardline nationalists. That's what they want. But on every other issue, I honestly believe the SNP will take any route, adopt any policy if they think it will help them with Scottish independence. So they present themselves as a social democratic party, and they probably are on the left. But when it comes to independence, put it this way: if conservative policy issues sort of guided them towards independence, I have no doubt they would adopt them. Um, and the sort of them and us mentality that the Nationals have promoted is nauseating, to be quite frank. Although Alistair Darling made a recent interview, he was, of course, one of the main Better Together campaigners. He'd done a recent interview like a few weeks ago, and he made some very good points about the position that Nicola Sturgeon is in. She's playing populism here, she's playing politics, she's playing to her base by constantly threatening a second referendum. Um, Alex Salmond done the same thing. I think it is very difficult for this to happen. I think she's playing to her base. I think she's a smart politician. I think that she's going to bide her time. But either way, she isn't going to win because if she calls a referendum now, it will hugely backfire. I'll explain why I believe that to be the case in a minute. But if she bides her time, then people will have lost an appetite for it. So either way, it isn't going to work. Consistent polls have shown that the Scots simply don't want another referendum. And I assume that is because they remember how divisive it was the last time. I saw a video, I didn't watch it, but I saw a video, obviously by a national, bemoaning the fact that unionists in question time are picking on her. But they don't sing the same tune when nationalists were, using very colourful language against Jim Murphy. And, heckling is one thing. Politicians are used to it. They expect that. Jim Murphy's a tough politician. He's got tough skin. But it got very nasty during that campaign. Um, and it is true that there was some unionists guilty of bad behaviour in the final days. But most of the bad behaviour that I saw was coming from nationalists. Businesses who supported the union were being intimidated and threatened. That's a total disgrace. Um, there was vandalism on both sides, but the bulk was against unionist supporters. Now, to be fair, there was some unionist hooligans who were acting like idiots on referendum night in Glasgow, and I condemn that. But I just don't buy this nationalist victimhood mentality because, and it's based sort of on two things. It's based on the present, like, oh, we poor Scots are being subjugated by the wicked English. What they need to understand is that people who are unionists don't have this great love of Westminster power. In fact, you'll find many unionists support regional devolution. It's not about love for Westminster, it's about love of the United Kingdom. That's something that they cannot grasp because they honestly believe that unionists are interfering in Scottish politics, as if Scotland is some distant place that we should keep our nose out of. Scotland, and I made this analogy before, if you have a member of your family who starts becoming an alcoholic or using drugs, are you going to just say, "Oh well, it's their business, it's their body, let's just leave them to it"? No, you'll be very, very concerned, and you'd want to help. So that's something nationalists cannot grasp. They think it's about wanting to keep Scotland down. They think it's about loving, this big monolithic Westminster. Nothing of the sort. Don't forget it was a unionist Labour government that gave Scotland devolved powers in the first place. Donald Dewar, the First Minister, was Labour through and through. He was Scottish through and through. And the same can be said for other great Scottish politicians, John Smith, Gordon Brown, I would say, for that matter. Now, Brown may not have been a great Prime Minister, but I do believe he made a fantastic speech in favour of the Union. Um, and I just feel the distortion that they're putting out there, that it's English versus Scots, or that it's Westminster versus Scots, is utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense. I remember the Adam Smith statues vandalised in Edinburgh during the referendum. Now, these people are losing sight of the fact Adam Smith was a Scotsman. There was one independence advocate, I believe it was Irvine Welsh, and I don't know whether he was being smart or just ignorant, but he said during the referendum, the Union is a way of stopping the Scots ruling the world. Now, I suppose he was having a sense of humour there, but that's factually inaccurate because the Scots did actually try their own empire. It was called the Darien Scheme, 1692, and it was a complete disaster. It almost bankrupted Scotland. Now, Scotland's golden age, the Enlightenment, came in the 1820s during the Union. That's a fact. And the thing about nationalists is they point to history and they point to all the injustices and the terrible things the English did. Look, history is cruel. Of course, there's injustices in history. Were there examples of English troops committing atrocities in Scotland? Sure, there were. But I have news for you. There was examples of Scottish armies committing atrocities in England. 1093, there was a Scottish king, I forget his name now, but 1093, 2 centuries before the First Scottish War of Independence, he raided into Northumbria. And do you think he sat down and had a cup of tea? No. The point is, medieval warfare was brutal on both sides. Okay, atrocities were committed by both sides. This is a fact. And if you really believe the nationalist nonsense, they would have you believe that it is basically just as Braveheart shows it. Now, the point about Braveheart was the screenplay was based almost entirely on the writings of a character called Blind Harry, writing in the 15th century. The most modern historians discredit Blind Harry as embellishing most of the information, and at the very least, it can't be verified because he was writing 2 centuries after these events. A bit like Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Arthurian legends, it's very, very hard to pinpoint these things exactly. Um, so that is, for me, is a big issue because I really do believe that there are nationalists who really do cling on to the past in that way. I typed in Battle of Roslyn because I wanted to see what sort of things came up, and what I found astonishing was that there were people in 2016 commemorating the Battle of Roslyn, but this wasn't some sort of let's recreate history educational event. It was about promoting Scottish nationalism. Now, Roslyn was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on British soil, and almost certainly the bloodiest battle fought on Scottish soil. Up to 30,000 men killed. And they're using a battle that occurred 7 centuries ago to try and push their political agenda today. So which side is really forward looking in this? You know, they accuse unionists of being parochial and inward looking. But it's the nationalists that want to go back in time. But coming back to the present, and just look at the basic issues here. Nicola Sturgeon is using the results of the EU referendum to kind of make this case for a second independence referendum. So she's arguing, why should the UK drag Scotland out of the EU when most Scots voted to stay in the EU? Now, notwithstanding the fact that the relatively low turnout compared to the Scottish referendum, that shows to me that actually a lot of Scots weren't that interested in the EU referendum because it was a similar turnout to general elections. But it's just utterly hypocritical for the SNP to, on one hand, talk about a once in a lifetime independence referendum, which they then subsequently ignore because they're pushing for a second referendum, whilst saying, oh, but wait a second, this was a result of the European referendum, we demand that you respect that. But the point is, EU referendum was not just Scotland, it was the UK as a whole. Now, I wasn't happy with the decision. I voted Remain. I believe we've made a big mistake. But what this country needs more than anything is stability. And the point is this. You know, nationalists will say, oh, you're a unionist, of course you want the UK to stay together. But it's not going to benefit them because if they get us independent Scotland now, at this time, this pathetic notion that they're going to just re-enter the EU, it doesn't work that way. And numerous senior officials of the European Union, who would be in the polar opposite of opinion in terms of the EU to Nigel Farage, have said that Scotland would have to go through the process. Scotland simply cannot enter just like that. Because then countries like Bosnia say, well, wait a second, why are they jumping the queue? So it just doesn't work that way. I think there should be some negotiation. I think there should be some compromise. So perhaps Scotland should have some rights to have, let's say, a unique trading agreement with the EU, issues like that. But in the end of the day, Scotland is a devolved home nation. It's not an independent country. And I think it would be preposterous for Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister to make these demands like she is a dictator, like she alone speaks for Scotland, to insult the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom by constantly making these demands. You know, it's just symbolic of this arrogance of the SNP. They constantly make demands from Westminster, but they're not offering any compromise in return. They're not. They're basically like children saying, "Give us this, but we're not going to give you anything back." Now that to me is utterly pathetic. I mean, that's not how political compromise works. But there is another point to this. Um, if the British government is so tyrannical, why did they give Scotland the referendum in the first place? If the British government was as tyrannical as the Nationalists make it out to be, there's no way the Scottish independence referendum would have even happened. The fact of the matter is, in many other parts of the world, the central government in power would have sent troops in. And in no way I wouldn't have wanted to see that, God no. But the point is, they vilify the United Kingdom. And I'm making the point that actually the British government has shown incredible tolerance. I would argue almost too much tolerance. I think this time the British government should put its foot down and say, no, you had the referendum, the result was clear, we're not going to give another one. And if Scotland then decides, or I should say, if the Scottish government, if the Nationalist government then decide to just make some sort of unilateral declaration of independence, they're going to get a nasty shock because no great power will accept it. No one. The Americans won't accept it. The French won't accept it. The Germans won't accept it. The Spanish won't accept it. The Chinese won't accept it. Russia, I don't know about. I think it would be foolish of Russia to do that because then we could turn around and say, okay, we recognize Chechen independence. Putin knows that. And the Chinese also know that with Tibet. And the difference is in those two countries, the governments there would brutally suppress any sort of uprisings, any sort of notion of independence. So it's time to get real. The Nationalists can argue till they're blue in the face. To be quite honest, I'm not interested in changing their opinion. Hardcore Nationalists have tunnel vision. I get that. But if you're sort of on the fence and you don't know about this, please consider the issues I'm talking about. Because if Scotland becomes independent now, Scotland will be in the wilderness. And this is not fear-mongering, it's simply the facts. This utopian vision that Nicola Sturgeon is telling you, that Scotland is just going to re-enter the EU, doesn't work that way. I mean, I am disappointed that we left the European Union, and I don't believe that there's any going back now, but this is not the end of the world. We're still going to be trading with our European partners. We're still European. I consider myself European. It's not like we're going to suddenly, it's not the end of the world. Just all just calm down. What the United Kingdom needs now is stability. We have had two divisive referendums in less than 2 years. We need stability. And the majority of Scots, time and time again, it is shown they do not want a second referendum. So Nicola Sturgeon says, it's my duty to represent the Scottish people. In that case, she should listen to them. And I just don't accept, it's all BBC propaganda, because this is independent polling stations. This isn't the BBC. This isn't the British government. This is independent pollsters, like Ipsos Mori, Comres, and others. The only time there was a slight sort of peak for desire for a second referendum was when May became Prime Minister, and that was brief. And that's, she's a Tory Prime Minister. Of course, she's not going to be popular in Scotland. But the point is this, if you don't like the Tories, vote against them. I'm no Tory. I vote against the Tories. Of course, to nationalists, everyone's one and the same. It's a very sectarian mindset they have. It's basically, if you're not with us, you're against us. So basically, anyone in Scotland who doesn't share their very narrow world vision is a tartan Tory, a traitor, etc. Well, quite frankly, I think it's time the British government starts fighting back and saying, well, wait a second, who is the traitors here? Because in the end of the day, the very purpose of nationalism is to break up this country. Those are the facts. And, I am passionate about this issue. I don't think it will happen again, but to be quite honest, even talk about it, I think is creating instability. It's creating instability for investors in Scotland. It's creating instability for the markets. It's creating instability all round. Scotland is a wonderful part of the world. I love Scotland. And Scotland will always, always, always have a unique character. It is a nation. It's a proud nation, and it's a great nation. But it is a constituent nation in a family of nations that is the United Kingdom. And that's the bottom line.